So my book asks and answers two questions. The first is, why do some nations have states and others don't? So for example, why do the Algerians and the Zionists have the states of Algeria and Israel today, whereas the Kurds and the Palestinians don't have independent states of Kurdistan and Palestine? And then secondly, why do some organizations within those national movements use violence or nonviolence to achieve their political goal of independence? So even though we might think of the Kurds or the Palestinians or the Algerians as being this kind of united whole, in fact, their movements are composed of mixes of organizations and individuals, many of whom are often at odds with one another, trying to lead the broader movement. And so those organizations have decisions to make. One of the key ones is, should we be running for office or doing marches or protests and boycotts, or should we be using insurgent or terrorist attacks to try to achieve our objectives? So my book answers simultaneously both of those questions. And in many ways, I see my answer to those questions as being the biggest contribution of the book. I base my argument on the idea of this kind of concept of where you stand depends on where you sit. The idea that where you are within your movement hierarchy, your relative strength, etc., that drives your incentive structure of whether you want to try to achieve victory or whether you want to actually try to forestall victory until you're in a better position to benefit from it organizationally. The basic idea is, if you're the top organization, you are actually likely to kind of inherit the benefits of office, wealth, and status in the new state because you'll be running it. Whereas if you're a weaker organization, you're less likely to do that, which means you're also more likely to do something risky like using violence. And so the argument is, weaker groups more likely to take risky adventures of using violence, stronger groups more likely to restrain violence but pursue victory. And then I have these empirical contributions where I spent many years doing fieldwork on these four in-depth cases. So the book simultaneously makes a new kind of unique argument about this stuff, as well as providing what I think is some new historiography for the Zionist movement in Israel, the Algerian national movement, the Palestinian national movement, and the Irish national movement. So I decided to look at what leads to a movement's success from a couple of angles. Number one, my background is in the study of security studies within political science. And there had been a lot of work when I was getting my PhD in the mid-2000s at MIT on kind of why groups use violence, why do groups opt to use violence, but less so on what it actually achieves for them. So when your group launches a terrorist attack or launches an insurgent attack, the question is not just whether the government kind of reacts in a certain way or does counterterrorism policy a certain way. It's also, does it give the group concessions? Does the organization get more notoriety, more recruits? Does it become stronger? Does it survive as an organization? And so I decided to say, look, I want to figure that out, not just in a vacuum where I look at an individual group and say, oh, what does an attack achieve, just for that individual group, but also collectively, because the vast majority of terrorist and insurgent violence happens in the context of civil wars or national movements. And so that's why I was kind of doing the simultaneous thing of saying, okay, I'm looking at the causes and effects of political violence, but I'm trying to look at those effects and effectiveness within the broader context of nationalism, of pushes for independence by nationalist groups. So that was kind of one aspect of it. The other is my regional focus is in the Middle East. And so in the Middle East, these issues of nationalism and where state borders should be or what states should exist or shouldn't exist are very live issues. In North America, there isn't too much debate about whether Canada should exist or whether, for the most part, Texas or Alaska should secede, although there's small groups who maybe believe that. But in the Middle East, these are very live issues. Should the Kurds have a state? Should the Palestinians have a state? Should the borders of Lebanon be where they are now? Should Kuwait be existing or should it be part of Iraq? I mean, there are people over the past century and still to this day who have strong disagreements about that stuff. And so my book, again, and my motivation for it was a lot to answer that broad question of when groups use violence and what it gets them, but also simultaneously to answer this key question at the core of the studies of the Middle East, which is, why do some nations within that region get states and others don't? Yeah, so to be honest, most books in political science or otherwise look at maybe one case in depth, one country, perhaps two. My book is a bit unique in that it looks at four in depth, and it took a great deal of time to do the legitimate field work to kind of make that happen. So a lot of it happened when I was a graduate student getting my PhD at MIT. I took over a year and a half living in Israel, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, and all these places where I was able to interview members of the Zionist movement who fought for the state of Israel, as well as members of the Palestinian national movement who fought for the state of Palestine. And so I was both doing interviews with people there and working in the archives, both of the state and of these organizations themselves. When I came to Boston College as an assistant professor, I had a choice where I could basically say, okay, I could try to publish basically that book, which would already be in depth on these two movements, and then do what we call kind of shadow cases, where I don't do field work, but I look at some other cases briefly, or I could really write the book I wanted to, which is to really go in depth as well on the Algerian national movement and the Irish national movement. And thankfully at BC, the administration gave me enough research support where I was able over the summers here while I was a professor to go live in Algeria, to go live in Belfast, to go live in Dublin. And it allowed me to do the same type of field work where I was interviewing members of the FLN who fought against France, or members of Sinn Féin who are political politically working against the British or trying to make Northern Ireland part of Ireland. And so the book itself is really, cohesive, and I think one of the main contributions, because it's not just, oh, there are these two, really well done, in-depth cases, and then these kind of, weak ones over here. Instead, all 4 of my empirical chapters involved many months, if not years, of fieldwork in multiple countries, multiple archives. I interviewed over 150 members of these kind of militant and political wings of these various national movements. And so I found the time over a series of years, but again, the support of both my graduate institution at MIT and Boston College were essential to that, but I'm very happy with the final product. So when we look around today, there are a lot of ongoing national movements. It's not a historical thing. We look in the newspapers, we see stuff about the Iraqi Kurds who had 93% of their people vote for independence in a referendum. We see similar things going on with Catalonia inside of Spain. We see similar things to some extent with the Palestinians. And so these are all national movements that don't yet have a state. And so my theory, movement structure theory, actually has a lot to say about them. One of the first arguments about success and failure is that if you're fragmented, if you have a number of significant factions inside your movement, you are less likely to be successful or get independence. Why? Because the groups themselves will spend a lot of time fighting each other and spending their scarce resources on either directly killing one another or at the very least trying to outcompete the other, as opposed to collectively and cohesively struggling against kind of that external enemy or for that collective goal of independence. And so when I look at the Palestinians today, I see Fatah and Hamas, where you have 2 significant political parties slash militant parties slash, certainly in Hamas's case, is still a group who commit terrorist attacks. And Hamas basically runs in a de facto manner Gaza, though that might be changing. And Fatah kind of runs the West Bank, these 2 kind of largely Palestinian areas that could be the potential basis for a Palestinian state. And yet if you look at some of the reasons there isn't a Palestinian state, you see this kind of fragmentation and internal squabbling being one of the main sources of their failures, both today and historically. When even Hamas wasn't around, it was Fatah versus the PFLP or the PLO or other Palestinian factions. You look at the Iraqi Kurds, it's a very similar story in many ways. You see groups like the KDP and the PUK. There's quotes from members of the PUK, this political party, who said, we would be against the declaration of an independent Kurdistan if it's announced at the head of Masoud Barzani, who's the head of the KDP. So again, this idea that collectively they all want the state of independent Kurdistan, but they want to be the ones who are declaring it, who are running it, etc. And in the broad sense, we think about democracies. Democracies are healthy because they have this type of competition. The problem is when you have that type of competition before the existence of a state, before maybe some strong pre-state institutions, it makes it so the competition sometimes takes on a violent character, and it also makes it so your message to the world about what you're trying to achieve and how you're trying to do it is not as clear and cohesive. And so it makes it less likely you'll get that state in the first place. In the case of Catalonia, I think they have some strong pre-state institutions. There is a parliament, et cetera, though it seems like the Spanish government is just dissembling that as we speak. But there also are, again, a number of different parties. So I think you could see some potential what we call outbidding or competition over street protests and whatnot, especially in response to the fact the Spanish government was pretty violent in reaction to some of the voting in Catalonia. But ultimately, if they have what I would call a hegemonic movement with one dominant political party or organization that's leading the way, it's not guaranteed they'll get success because they're not handing out states on street corners. The majority of national movements do not get independence, but your chances are much higher of getting independence if you have a hegemonic movement instead of a fragmented one. I think the sign of any good research project is that you are surprised by something. Otherwise, you always have to worry that the person had these pre-existing assumptions about what happened, and then, oh, by the way, that's exactly what they found, and maybe there's an element of bias there. So first off, there were a lot of unknowns with my project. One of my main contributions was there is not data that exists on all these various organizations inside of national movements and their relative strengths and weaknesses by year over time. There's a broad sense of, oh, okay, we have this number of states, we have this number of national movements, but when you actually break it down, the Palestinian national movement has had, upwards of 20 different factions, the Zionist movement upward of 15 factions, many factions among Algerians, Irish, etc. And so to get information on all those organizations, how many members they have, how much funding they have, how much popular support they have, again, in a broad sense, there's information out there, but there wasn't an existing data set or anything like that for by-year information on all those organizations. So going into the project, I was set up to be surprised just because I had no idea exactly what the ebb and flow would be of those organizations and their relative strength over time. That's in fact what I spent many years doing, collecting information and data, whether through archives or interviews or some secondary source literature, to kind of create that data set to allow me to do the analysis. After I did the analysis, I was surprised by a number of things. The first is this idea of, the stronger groups who are going to actually pursue victory and the weaker ones who are not going to. Even though that kind of theoretically made sense, it was still quite surprising to see in action, because we have this idea, and I think I did it as well, that when you're part of a national movement, your main goal is independence, right? That's what you want above all else. Except though, when you look at groups who are in a weaker position, it's not that they don't care about independence, they just prioritize other things above that. So you see these secret negotiations between groups where they say things like, yeah, this occupying power might leave and our independent movement might succeed, but we maybe don't want that right now. We actually want to take some time and make it so our group becomes stronger than our rivals, and then we actually want victory. And that's something that I didn't expect. Even though I thought relatively those groups might not be as on board with pursuing victory at that moment, I didn't think it would get to the point that they would actively talk about their organizational interests really superseding those broader collective interests, because certainly that's not what they'll say publicly. So I was certainly surprised by that. And then honestly, the other thing I was really surprised by, though again, had some anticipation about this, is just interviewing people who are former terrorists or former militants. On the one hand, I have no problem and generally feel that what those people have done is generally an abhorrent thing. I mean, the idea of actively killing and purposely killing civilians for pretty much any purpose, I think, is something that's just evil morally. But that doesn't mean that there isn't potentially rationale behind why they're doing that, and also that these people, unfortunately, when you talk to them, are not necessarily just personally these crazed demons or something like that. A lot of them are incredibly well educated, very well spoken, at least in the broader sense of understanding why they would want to push for independence. You can sometimes get on board and understand that, even if you totally depart from them and how they tried to achieve that. So that was also difficult, honestly, as a researcher and someone doing interviews, is that it's not so black and white when you start to talk to people. It's not that you support their methods or their tactics, but you can also understand, hey, if someone came and invaded the United States and started to oppress, my people around me, and, my mother gets slapped at a checkpoint or something like that, it's like all of a sudden I'm not sure if I would just sit back and say, well, all is fine. And so that was both a surprising and a challenging thing in the course of the research. The project on national movements and political violence is one of my favorite things and one of my proudest achievements at BC, and to be honest, it's a collective achievement. So when I arrived at BC in the fall of 2012, I had a number of students who came up to me and said, hey, Professor Krause, I want to do research with you. I'm interested in the Middle East. I'm interested in political violence. And BC has a great program here, the Undergraduate Research Fellow Program, where you get funding generally for 1 or 2 students if you apply and you have a good project. Well, they'll get paid, a certain amount of money per hour to kind of do research with you. But I honestly had, 10, 20 plus students who would come be interested, and I could only fund 1 or 2 of them. So eventually I said, you know what, I can't pay everybody, but I can give you great experience of how to do sophisticated research. You're not going to do photocopying. You're going to help me look through archival documents, or you're going to help me create and code data sets, or you're going to help me read the scholarship on this current issue, and then we're going to talk about where the gaps are, or where my argument fits in, et cetera. You're going to help me generate slides for some of my talks. You're going to help me proofread my books. I mean, basically all the tasks that I do. One of the big challenges is finding tasks that undergraduates can do that it's still worthwhile for them and still worthwhile for me to have them help me with it. But it's been wonderful. And after a year or 2 of kind of working out the kinks about how do we actually share documents through Dropbox or Google Docs, how do I keep tabs on a large number of students while still mentoring them, it's been a wonderful, I think, well-oiled machine in many ways, to the point that I've had up to almost 20 students working for me in a given semester, very highly motivated undergraduates, sometimes some graduate students as well. But the stuff we've been able to produce has been wonderful. I mean, I wouldn't have been able to do all the research that I have in terms of publication, in terms of whatnot, without this type of support. And, in terms of the proof being in the pudding for the students, I've had now about 80 students who have been part of the team. Many of them have gone on to jobs in government, in NGOs, in graduate school or otherwise. And, almost to a person, they'll often cite the experience they had for this project as a way of learning kind of outside the classroom, but also, again, in a very independent way where I'm mentoring them and teaching them skills, but also giving them a great deal of responsibility, either just for their own work or for overseeing that of others. And so that's something that, again, I do both to help my own research, but also really to mentor and help Boston College students. So it's certainly one of my proudest achievements, and it's something I hope to do here for the rest of my career. Now that the book is published, I have 3 other big projects I'm working on. First, I have an edited volume, another book coming out later this year, in the end of 2017, early 2018, which is called Coercion, the Power to Hurt in International Politics. And what that does is it looks at coercion, this idea of using or threatening force to get what you want, but not from kind of the conventional perspective of using nuclear weapons or something like that. We look at cyber coercion, we look at forced migration, where states like Libya under Gaddafi would say, I'm going to let migrants go into Europe unless you guys pay me, or something like that. And then also my type of work, which looks at kind of insurgent or nationalist coercion. And so I actually test my argument from rebel power on cases I hadn't thought about at all when I was kind of analyzing or generating the theory. In this case on Eritrea, the first kind of post-colonial success of an independent state inside of Africa. So that book will come out, again, early 2018 or so. The second big project, which is kind of my next book I'm going to write, entirely just my book, is kind of called To Which Victor Go the Spoils? And the basic question is, when you have regime change, something like Bashar al-Assad overthrown in Syria, or Gaddafi in Libya, or whoever else, wherever else, which of these organizations that's trying to overthrow that individual actually comes to power? Because my book Rebel Power had an assumption about that. It said the stronger groups will come to power, the weaker ones will not, and that's why they'll act the way that they do regarding victory and violence. But that was just a theoretical assumption. I didn't have any empirical evidence for that when I wrote that book. So this next book will actually empirically try to answer that by saying, okay, when you have a revolution, which of these factions come to power? The most ideologically extreme group because they have revolutionary ideas, the group who kind of was seen as leading the revolution by the people on the street, so they get some cred and they get some support for that, the group that's the most cohesive organizationally or the largest, which is kind of my argument. That's what I'm investigating. And I'm not sure what the answer is going to be. That's one of the great things about scientific discovery. But with my team, the Project on National Movements and Political Violence, we're creating this massive data set of all insurgencies since World War I and looking at all the organizations within them and then which ones came to power, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years after the revolution. And so we'll be able to pretty cohesively answer this question, which to be honest has bedeviled policymakers, intel, etc. The US government didn't do a great job predicting who would come to power when the Shah fell in Iran, didn't do a great job predicting who would come to power in Libya after Gaddafi was overthrown. And so this is a question I think of interest not just to scholars but also to policymakers. And then finally, the third project is a co-author project with Professor Leanne Young in the Psychology Department at Boston College and Jordan Theriot, a recent PhD from the Psychology Department at Boston College. And this is kind of based on a bunch of surveys we did at BC and other schools around the country where we looked at when your knowledge about terrorism changes. Because you take a class, like my class on terrorism at BC, or you watch a video online or something, what happens to your attitudes about terrorism? Are you more afraid of it, less afraid of it? Do you ultimately feel that the terrorists are more dehumanized? Do you humanize them? What type of counterterrorism policies do you support? And there's a lot of talk about this, whether by policymakers or others who say, oh, if you knew what I know, you'd agree with me on this stuff. But no one's really empirically tested in an experimental way when your knowledge kind of goes up or down, what happens to your attitudes on terrorism. So we had one article come out earlier this year in 2017 on this issue. We have other ones that are in the pipeline. And so that's kind of the third final project. But yeah, lots of exciting stuff and look forward to what's to come.